I don't know that I've ever read any of his that I wouldn't recommend. So Joyce is very fond of this one. You can hold it up again, Joyce, if you want. So I don't have my copy of it here right now. Embracing Life, which is very short little essays. I think that they were collected from his BBC Morning Thoughts. So they're it's a really accessible way into what he thinks, and some of them are topical, to the moment that they were given, which in some cases it reminds us of whatever that time was. In other cases, we may have completely forgotten what he was talking about, but it's a nice little book.
Yeah.
Dignity of difference is incredibly fine also.
Right.
What I found really compelling when I finished the book last night was yesterday in the New York Times, in the Sunday Review section, there was an op-ed about how our attention has been diverted since the beginning of the internet. And I don't know how many people have read it, but I was able to combine what Rabbi Sachs wrote about democracy and then reading the op-ed in the New York Times, and they both just rang home to me so true, and how they seem to intersect with one another.
I'll have to take a look at that article. I didn't get very deep into the New York Times yesterday, I have to say, but I have it. So I'll try to get to that and see. So, but we're going to talk. We're not quite to the end of the book yet. We're going to talk about chapters 11 and 12 today, I believe. And so let's get started. I think that it's probably worth thinking back to the very beginning of the book and what Rabbi Sachs sets out to do. So he starts out, remember, with his question about why be Jewish, right? And then the rest of the book, of course, is his way of answering that question through a variety of routes. And so that continues through each section of the book. And so we're in this section here where we, the vision, right? So we started that last week with Rabbi Evan, and we conclude it this week. So, and I would say that his goal really is to try and point out unique aspects of Judaism. The question in my mind sometimes is whether those unique aspects are not also part of other faiths and traditions, either because Judaism actually gave birth to those traditions in some ways, and also because other faiths have adopted some of these things over time. But that doesn't lessen the case that he makes for this extraordinary vision of Judaism that he has, this understanding of a covenant partnership between humans and God. This is a really good example where I think other faiths also talk about this partnership between humans and God to a greater or lesser extent. But I think it's very fair to say that they learned that from Jewish tradition, and this idea that that Rabbi Evan was talking about last week about some of these sort of truly innovative aspects of how Judaism saw the role of the individual. That people weren't there to serve the king, but that each has their own, and each person has his or her own inherent value, and how that's actually a step forward in the journey of faith in the world. So I think most faiths, if not all today, would say that individuals have inherent value, but there is a question here of where do we learn that from? And one of the places we learn that from is from that phrase that Rabbi Sachs talks about, B'Tselem Elohim, being made in the image of God. So here in chapter 11, he's going to take that sort of this question of individuality and the importance of each individual and bring that into a more of a group structure, right? So in chapter 11, he really is talking about the synagogue and the history of the synagogue. And again, this kind of remarkable reinterpretation of Judaism that comes starting with the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, and then really finding its full flower after the destruction of the second temple by the Romans in the year 70. So this time period, of course, predates Christian churches, right? You know, so and certainly Islam, you know, which is centuries later, right? So the idea of um, that you can build a place of worship wherever you are, that it's not tied in a sense to a very specific place. As much as Jerusalem has always been at the heart of Judaism, at least for the last couple of thousand years, it was always a symbolic kind of connection until very recently. And more importantly, if you lived in Warsaw, you could build a synagogue. If you lived in Babylon, you could build a synagogue. If you lived in Rome, you can build a synagogue, right? And that those places are not wholly by virtue of um, you know, in some sort of a way that they're a shrine, right? That some the way Mount Sinai would be a shrine, right? It's the fact that we don't know where Mount Sinai actually is an important sort of theological, sociological idea in Judaism, that we don't build shrines, we build synagogues. And so in some ways, I would say that the development of the synagogue and the development of the Christian church are both responses to the same event, right? They're both responses to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And in one case, you know, it's a redefining of Judaism and putting the emphasis on Torah and mitzvot and on the things we do. And on the other, and Rabbi Sachs talks about this, is the reaction that Paul has, right, to this idea, right, that the ancient covenant is no more. And like a woman whose husband has died, so humanity is free to marry again. So from the early Christian viewpoint, and remember that those early Christians were in fact Jews who were responding in a sense to what was going on in the Roman Empire. And their sense was, well, the destruction of the temple means the destruction of Judaism, in a sense, the death of Judaism. The like a woman whose husband has died, right? And so they are, these Jews ultimately become Christians. That divide eventually happens. And this is not, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not an immediate thing. It doesn't, you know, it takes a couple of centuries really for that divide to become complete, I'd say. And divide may be too strong a word even now, right? But you know, so that's one response. The other response is, now that there's no temple, no high priest, atonement no longer needs to be vicarious, made through a priest, right? So the diminishing role of the Kohen, right, the priest in Jewish tradition, is seen not as something that's a death knell to Judaism by any means, just the opposite. It's kind of a freeing of Judaism from this intermediary. And so it becomes, and so Sachs sees this as the rise of the individual in importance here, right? We no longer need any intermediary to have a relationship with God. We don't need Moses to tell us what God said and how we should behave. We don't need the priest to make a special sacrifice on our behalf in order to achieve closeness with God. it becomes sort of the first step along the path, the way Judaism has developed over 2,000 years, that each one of us has our own relationship with God. We can see this exemplified in so many ways in our tradition. One that we say all the time and don't think about very much is when we say the Avot prayer at services, and we say, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Sarah, God of Rebecca, God of Rachel, God of Sarah, God of Leah, and so on. The tradition asks the question, why don't we just say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And the answer is that in each generation, each one of the patriarchs and matriarchs has his or her own distinct connection to God. And therefore, it's not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the God of each of them as individuals. Each of us as individuals has our own special connection to God. And so that response to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem diminishes the role of the priesthood. It's interesting that in a sense, Christianity, which says, the ancient covenant is no more, and humanity is free to marry again, actually retains the priesthood in certainly at this time historically, and then you find in after the Protestant Reformation some changes, I think, in the idea of what the priest is and what the priest does, but so that you get all, ministers and things which are a different role. The role of minister, in a sense, is closer to the role of rabbi, right? The role of the priest in Orthodox Christianity and still in Roman Catholicism too. I think it's fair to say that the priest still remains a kind of an intermediary between human beings and God. And I'm sure Meredith could speak to this, that I think in the Episcopal Church, it's a little bit more of a hybrid, right? That's them say, the priest
there's no
walk the way to God for the individual.
No, but certainly the reminder of God's forgiveness, and therefore the one who you might say forgives sins in that sense, but also retaining the very Jewish notion of a priesthood of all believers.
Yeah. So right. I mean, and this is, I think Rabbi Evan talked about this last week, the phrase that we actually just read in the Torah this week, in the Torah portion for last Shabbat, where God refers to the Israelites as a kingdom of priests, right? That everyone, and there's sort of two ways of looking at that, I suppose. But the point is that everyone has that same power to connect to holiness, right? That there isn't someone who stands in our way of connecting us. And so the destruction of the temple becomes the sort of linchpin in freeing Judaism to be practiced wherever Jews are. And of course, by that time, Jews were in a lot of places, right? I mean, even as, shortly at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, for sure, and possibly long before that, Jews were not only in Babylon, as they had been forced to be for 5 centuries, from 586 BCE on to the time of the Roman occupation, but we find Jews in all sorts of far-flung places in all around the known world at that point. So we have very early examples of synagogues in places like Morocco and in Italy, all along the Mediterranean, and as far away as Morocco. We have stories of Jews in Morocco becoming part of Berber tribes, long before anything that we would call the modern state of Morocco. So, so Jews move away from the priesthood and certainly from the idea of sacrifice, so that you find all of these examples in the books of prophets of turning away from the letter of the law of sacrifice and more towards the 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 idea of repentance, right, and of righteous action, so that you get the words of Micah, which Rabbi Sachs quotes, that what is it that God wants from us? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God, right? And then on page 149, he quotes Rabbi Akiba from Pirkei Avot, from the sayings of our ancestors, which are in the Mishnah. So 2,000 years ago, I mean, around this time, these words are written down. As Rabbi Akiva reminds us, not one, but every Jew is the son or daughter of God. So that, which is also interesting because, this phrase, the Son of God, of course, becomes something different in Christianity than it is in Judaism, but it starts from the same place, right? That every one of us is the child of God. And we see that, I think we maybe talked about the Midrash, not sure if that was in this class last week, where we talked about the Midrash after the sea splits and comes back on the Egyptians. And in the Midrash, God admonishes the Israelites for celebrating and singing Michamocha. He says, how can you celebrate? My children, the Egyptians, are drowning, right? And, it's clearly a statement that every human being is the child of God, right, in that sense. So Judaism takes a somewhat different path along that way than the early history of Christianity takes it, right? Kind of a literalism in a sense. So,
Except in baptism, very specifically, the words are spoken that in baptism, Christians become sons, adopted sons and daughters of God. So
right.
that feeling of being a child of God is picked back up again.
Yeah. So I mean, it would take days just to parse this, but I think it's it's very interesting, and there is a kind of we're not adopted,
Right.
so so we don't. I mean, it's why, in a sense, Judaism hasn't ever needed something like baptism, right?
Maybe that's the chief difference,
Yeah.
that we're adopted and you're not.
Which that can take us into some darker corners that we don't want to go to, but it's just sort of interesting that the phrase "the child of God" gets, for a little while at least, is interpreted very literally when it refers to Jesus, and metaphorically when it refers to everybody else, right? And that's where the difference lies in some way, But so that ideal of Sinai, right, this idea of a kingdom of priests becomes real after the destruction of the temple. The value of the individual, the ability of each human to encounter God without intermediation of priests and rabbis, priests and Moses, rather. Also of rabbis, of course, but that's a later time period. So as Rabbi Sachs puts it on page 150, he says, it took the loss of Israel's national independence to bring about the flowering of its religious vision. So it's actually in the destruction of Jerusalem that our faith of Judaism, in a sense, is reborn, reinterpreted, and we create something that can last for thousands of years without without a state of our own, which is one of the things that, of course, is highly unusual about Judaism, that we have persisted through all of this time. It's interestingly enough, I think some of you have heard me talk about this. I mean, I had the opportunity many years ago to meet the Dalai Lama. He came and spoke to the Central Conference of American Rabbis conference, which was in Canada, close to 30 years ago now. And a small group of us actually got to meet with him in a small group setting as well. The interesting thing, of course, is that the Dalai Lama came to talk to us and was interested in dialogue with Judaism for precisely the reason that we're talking about. How does a culture survive without a home for thousands of years? Right? And seeing that there's no close to hand end to the occupation of Tibet by the Chinese, the Lama was looking for the wisdom of Judaism to help inform this question of how does a community survive without a homeland. And we rabbis had a lot to offer. And of course, we wanted to hear from him about the spirituality of Tibetan Buddhism, because Jews and Judaism has a lot to learn from that experience as well. So it's really a highlight of my time as a rabbi, actually, to have spent that time with the Dalai Lama. And it's, he has taken to heart a lot of the things that that we talked about, that this group and other groups of Jews talked to him about. If you want to read more about stuff like that, there's a book by, what's his name? Roger Kamenetz, The Jew in the Lotus, which talks about a small group of Jews meeting with the Dalai Lama and talking about these things. Kind of a fascinating side note to this. We are no longer about a land and a state. I mean, that's what Rabbi Sachs says on page 152. Judaism, no longer a religion of land and state, became a faith built around homes, schools, and communities. And so that's what he says takes the place in the way of the temple, is the building of the synagogue, the school, and the yeshiva. And he sees that in sort of different, as serving different parts of the community, different needs of the community, so that wherever Jews go, one of the first things they have to establish is a school to pass on the ideas of Judaism to the next generation. And then beyond that, they build a synagogue, a place for the whole community to gather for prayer, for social activities, for that matter. And then perhaps the last component is the yeshiva, the higher learning aspect, the place that traditionally trains rabbis to care for the other two aspects, the synagogue and the school, to become the teachers in the yeshiva. So each of those institutions, synagogue, school, and yeshiva, in its own way represents covenant, which he defines again and again, I think, in these chapters, as he does in chapter 7, a morally binding pact among parties that respects the freedom and dignity of each while bringing them together in creative partnership. Right? So that that's what a synagogue should be, right? A morally binding pact among parties. So each of us as individuals have our own path to God, but we find our truest experience of the world in community, not alone. We're not individual islands. So the covenant with Israel as a people under the constitution of the Torah. Right? So it's a group experience as well as an individual experience. I want to see if there are any thoughts or questions before I go on a little bit.
I have
Yeah, please.
Okay, I have a thought. Now, I
Yeah.
always interpreted the birth of the synagogue to be well before the destruction of the temple,
Yeah.
that there were synagogues in multiple towns around Judah, as well as in Alexandria, probably in Persia, today's Iran.
Yeah.
There may have been a synagogue or multiple. And Herod built a synagogue in every one of his mountain fortresses.
Mhm.
In each one, they have uncovered a synagogue with everything that's necessary to support it.
Yeah.
So synagogue, and so how did Judaism survive? I think it wasn't the Pharisees or the Sadducees. They were all slaughtered when the synagogue was destroyed in 70, when Rome was destroyed, or almost destroyed in 70. It was finished in the Bar Kokhba War, 135, completely destroyed Jerusalem. But I think it continued to the teachers in the individual synagogues around Judah and other places. And they continued and became known as the rabbis in the late first century. And they are the ones who codified the Bible we use today and included and or did not include the Apocrypha and things like that. But that's what I think is what happened, and that's a guess. Uh, there's very little written about it. There's very little known about it because so much was destroyed.
Right. So, like, this is not a process though that happens overnight, right? And that's sort of the point I think
Hundreds of years.
making, and I think you are as well. That that this is a process that's 6 or 7 centuries long, when you really think about it, right?
Right.
That with the first destruction, the Babylonian destruction, and the expulsion of the
586.
Jews from Jerusalem, that's really when I think we'd say that that's, up till then there were competing sites in Judaism, right? I mean, Bethel, which is mentioned in the book of Genesis, is kind of a competing site to Jerusalem, right? But they're both these singular places where you could go. So if you lived in the southern kingdom, you definitely went to Jerusalem to make sacrifice and
Right.
use the priest to do that. If you lived in the northern kingdom before it was overrun by the Assyrians,
Israel.
the kingdom of Israel, then Bethel was kind of a competing site. And in the
Gerizim.
in the 7th century BCE, King Josiah it kind of puts an end to that northern site and says only Jerusalem is the place where you can go. But it's only 40 years after King Josiah that the first temple is destroyed. Jews end up in the first sort of diaspora,
Right.
and there's no question that they start building these different sites. And the fact that what you brought up about King Herod, and that there's a synagogue on top of Masada,
Right.
is proof in the sense that the idea of synagogue, um, goes back to the time before that, right? It's already sort of an accepted practice by the time the second temple is destroyed.
Right.
But why some of our scholars say, the temple was destroyed, it's got to happen, right? It's not, the common story is that because Jews didn't agree with each other because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred among Jews, that the temple was destroyed. But there are other contemporary accounts that says, this is God telling us that this is not how God wants us to worship anymore, right? To replace sacrifice with prayer. And so it becomes that. And so this is a 6th century long project, which, I'd say that, when Rabbi Sachs writes about it, and I think my historical understanding certainly agrees with his, is that the final nail in the coffin, in a sense, is the destruction of the temple by the Romans, right? So there's already, this move has been going, you know, more or less along this path for centuries, as I think that's what you're intimating, Gil, right? Yeah. So it just gets sort of its final, right? I mean, it becomes now until the 20th century when things change a little bit after the birth of the state of Israel. But now the longing for the temple becomes just a symbolic thing, right? We will worship in our synagogues, and in our synagogues, we will say prayers about the rebuilding of the temple, but only symbolically, as a kind of an end of time sort of prayer, right? The 20th century, with the rebirth of the state of Israel, you get a couple of small aberrant groups who actually want to rebuild the temple.
Yes.
But it also, you know, as not a messianic thing, but you know, let's destroy the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple. But that's a very small kind of aberrant group. And so that even in Jerusalem today, the prayer is not meant literally to rebuild. You know, we want to rebuild the state of Israel. We don't want to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Right? So instead, the idea is that we all become a mikdash me'at, a small sanctuary, a small temple, a small mikdash, right, which is a holy place. Wherever we are. And that applies to each one of us as an individual. Each of us is a small sanctuary. And together, we are part of a group that builds a Mikdash Me'at. It's not as glorious as the ancient temple in Jerusalem, but it's it's a holy place because our minyan is in it, right? If you,
Right.
as Reform Jews, we may not even count a minyan, but but the idea of community, right? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Great. Thank you, Gil. Anything else?
Um,
I think I hear Marilyn.
Henry, going back to when we studied the Mishkan, and Hashem said, I will dwell among you.
Yes.
And building the Mishkan gave the Jewish people a chance to, the commentaries say, parallel the creation, God's creation of the world. The Israelites were able to create the Mishkan. And when God says, I will dwell among you, it's in our hearts. He doesn't really dwell in the sanctuary. He dwells, as you were saying, each one of us is a synagogue. Each one of us is a is a living, excuse me, a living vessel, and God dwells within each one of us.
Right. Yeah, I actually wrote that down somewhere, and I can't find it in my notes, but this phrase from the book of Shemot at the building of the tabernacle, which interestingly enough, of course, the tabernacle is a tent, right? A mishkan that the Israelites built wherever they went, right? But the phrase in Exodus, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, build me a sanctuary that I may dwell among you. Actually, the congregation where Rabbi Moffat grew up part of his time in Milwaukee, and where his parents still are, has that on the wall in the sanctuary. That's one of the phrases that's emblazoned on the wall there. We used to teach about it there. I had the blessing of being an associate rabbi there for 6 years, a long time ago, when that sanctuary was first built. But the phrase "V'shochanti b'tocham," that I may dwell among you, can also be interpreted so that I can dwell within you. So that the act of a community coming together and building a temple, building a sanctuary, building a mishkan, right, allows the presence of God to be within each of us, right? So the group, the fact of working as a group, right? That's the one of the interesting things about that phrase is that it's in the plural, right? Together build a sanctuary, and then God will dwell within each one of us. Right? So it's a very beautiful verse from Torah.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Andy Amon has her hand up.
Okay.
So this is very closely, what all this conversation is very closely to my question related. And I got into a discussion years ago with a rabbi because I understood what he was saying to be that Jews must be in community and you cannot pray by yourself. And that just didn't, resonate with me. And I hear confusing messages in these historical facts or whatever, and in the, and in how you're interpreting. I'm just not clear. Is that something that we're really not supposed to do that, or what?
Well, of course, there's a difference here between Orthodox and conservative and Reform when it comes to these things. But I think even among Reform Jews, we might say that it's better to be in community. But if you're alone, it doesn't mean you shouldn't pray. And I think Orthodoxy says that too, right? It's if you're in a place where there is no minyan, there are certain prayers that you don't say according to Orthodox tradition. As far as Reform Jews go, I always say, look, we don't have to count to 10 people before we'll say Kaddish, for example, right? So there is, in that sense, we are departing from Orthodox tradition, which requires for certain things, it requires, of course, in Orthodoxy, it requires 10 Jewish men to say these things. But we would say that the value and support that you get from community is powerful and important. But if that's not available to you for whatever reason, like a pandemic, for example, saying prayers on your own is better than not saying prayers. So
You can be Jewish and not be in community. You could go off on is that or not?
I think this one was, again, I'd say from a Reform perspective, I'd say yes, you can, but you should always be looking for community. In the same sense, look, a couple of chapters ago when Rabbi Sachs talks about it's not good for a person to be alone, right? That the creation of Eve, the separation of Eve from Adam, in a sense, is done because it's not good for us to be alone. It's a model for us that in that covenant, you can't have a covenant with yourself, right? Right. So covenant requires another. That other can be God, and that's one part of the covenant. But that's just the model covenant for how you can be with people, right? So you have the idea is to do both. But if you were alone on a desert island, it would still be better to have a covenant with God than not have one. It would still be better to pray than not to pray. But thank goodness most of us are not, even in this time of pandemic, out on our own, desert island. So we're still looking for ways to connect. And he says that that's a human thing, Rabbi Sachs. And I think he's probably right. I mean, I don't have the background in psychology and sociology to say, but, but certainly we have so much, experience of no man is an island, right? I mean, that we are better in connection with others, and that we are trying to learn how to have that connection and make that connection a covenantal connection, where we actually, as he says, as I said over and over, a morally binding pact among parties that respect the freedom and dignity of each while bringing them together in creative partnership. So being part of a group, but that also doesn't mean that the individual disappears and bows only to the whims of the community. I mean, the other part of this is that Judaism emphasizes the ability to disagree for the sake of God. And I think, Rabbi Evan, you mentioned that last week as well, right? That came up in your chapters, and it continues in these chapters to say that the argument for the sake of God is holy.
Machlochet l'shem shamayim.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's got to be, right. It's we don't have to agree, but our disagreements should be agreeable. Right.
That's right.
Yeah, I see. Sarah.
I have a couple comments. You talk about the evolution of the concept of a Mishkan. It's interesting now that our prayer book is called Mishkan Tefillah because it's like prayer has become our tent.
Yes, and that's not an accident, of course. I mean, that was exactly what the editors of that prayer book had in mind, I think. Mishkan's a funny word. It's got a lot of different meanings and connections. It's the root for the word Shekhinah, the closest dwelling, the closest presence of God, according to the mystics and the Kabbalah, right? So Mishkan reflects that as well, this place where humans and God connect, right? And it also, in modern Hebrew, is the root for neighborhood, right? So, the community. So Mishkan, is both the tabernacle, but it's what that really means is the tent of meeting, right? The place where the community comes together.
Wow,
So now we come together in prayer. So
that's a very nuanced word then.
yes, it really is.
A lot of different aspects. In terms of neighborhood, I found out today that something I didn't know, that Highland Park has an Eruv.
Yes, yeah.
And I thought that was quite interesting. So the idea of an Eruv is you're really in your own home in terms of the laws of Shabbat when you're within this delineated area.
Right. If people don't know what an Eruv is, right, it's on Shabbat, there are some activities that are forbidden, and carrying things from place to place is forbidden. But an Eruv is kind of a fictitious wall around a community. In the case, usually it's literally a wire, and that's what it is in Highland Park. There's a wire, it goes along telephone poles all along the outskirts of Highland Park, and it allows people to understand that for Orthodox Jews in all of Highland Park, they can make a dish in their house and bring it to a friend's house for Shabbat, right? Not during pandemic, perhaps, but at other times, right? And so every Friday before Shabbat, somebody actually has the job of driving the Eruv, going all the way around, making sure that the wire isn't broken anywhere. And if the wire's broken, then before Shabbat, they'll send out an email and say, the Eruv isn't working this weekend, right? If by chance it can't be repaired in time for Shabbat. But I mean, the first ideal would be to fix it, so that people can carry stuff on Shabbat. But the whole idea of the Eruv is to enlarge the concept of community so that people can be together to celebrate on Shabbat. Right? But yeah, there is one in Highland Park. There's one in Skokie. I mean, there are probably some other neighborhoods around Chicago with an Eruv. So.
Is it near the Chabad?
West Rogers Park has a famous
one
because they had to build an archway on a bridge to maintain the Eruv that they had delineated.
Right, in Rogers Park. But where is it in Highland Park? So
it goes around the outskirts of Highland Park. So it has to surround the entire, everything inside the wire is within the Eruv. And if you live outside the Eruv, then you can't carry into the Eruv. But so it's not in one place. It's miles long.
Is it all of Highland Park?
No, I don't
Highland
think.
Park is within the Eruv.
I saw a map today, and it includes Highland Park Hospital, but
Yeah.
Highland Park Hospital is near the north border of it.
Right. So it's like a wire that's mounted on telephone poles, essentially.
And Commonwealth Edison allows that?
I'm sorry, what does?
Commonwealth Edison allows that?
I guess so. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I'm sure they got permission to do it.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, but like I said, so someone goes with it with his or her car and drives around and makes sure that the wire isn't broken anywhere.
Hmm.
And if it is, if they can fix it right away, they do. And if for some reason they can't, they'll say, well, there's no Eruv this weekend, right? There's no Eruv this Shabbat. So, um, so, um, so, you know, in answer to his question that he asks in the first chapter, why be Jewish? You know, his answer of these things that he sees as unique contributions of Judaism, certainly in its early times and still of value to the very present, is the holiness of the individual, that we're all B'Tselem Elohim, that there is a covenant of faith, this connection between human beings and God, and there's this covenant of community, which gets to Andy's question in a sense that it's best to have both of those things, right? The covenant of faith, which is the individual connection with God, but also the covenantal relationships that we have with others. And that brings him to chapter 12, right? Chapter 12, which is called Truth Lived, is how to take these messages of being B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God, and the connectivity of the human to the divine, and live that out in our daily practice, right? So that how we live should be in accordance with those covenantal values of treating others with respect and mutuality in all of our relationships. He says, and I would agree, one of the great challenges of our age as Jews, now that the state of Israel is reborn, is how to live those values when we actually have power, right? That in some ways it's easier to do those things when we are the subject of others. And it may be harder to do those things when Jews are in a position of power. And so this is certainly, you know, he's speaking about this in terms of the modern state of Israel for sure, but also in terms of who we are and our relative power, even though we're such a small minority in a place like America, we still matter. And that's difficult. It adds a level of difficulty in a sense, because power tends to want to preserve itself, right? And that preservation of power is sometimes does not work with our covenantal values, right? Of how we treat others. So, so he spoke about in the chapters that Rabbi Evan was talking about how our religion is based on being the slaves that have been freed, right? And taking the side of the enslaved. And that's perhaps harder to maintain when we own the means of production, right? When we're the employer and not the employee. And that's a challenge, right? And he wants us to rise to that challenge and expects Judaism to rise to that challenge, right? Looks like, Rabbi Evan, did you want to say something? It looks like you do. I think you're on mute.
No, I think that, but that's something that I think Emil Fackenheim also talked about a lot.
Yeah.
That the challenges of being in power, and that, you know, that grew even more, not just in the state of Israel, but it grew after 1967 when, you know, Israel controlled so much territory. And that's been a big problem. And there were a lot of historians that talked about how most of Jewish history has been written as one long lament. That was called the lachrymose theory of Jewish history. And that historians today have to sort of look at it differently and say, actually, we have power, and power is a good thing. I mean, well, you could say power is a good thing, but it also creates a whole bunch of responsibilities. It's kind of like the difference between being a child, a minor, and being an adult. You have greater responsibility.
Yeah. Well, and that's, not as heady as Emil Fackenheim, but Marvel Comics, I mean, that's what they say to Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility, I mean, and we have to understand that the more power we have, the more responsible we have to be. And that's a difficult thing to do. And in some ways easier without power, right? So, and for Rabbi Sachs, a life based in Torah and studying Torah, that's the way to get to this, continuing to live out our covenantal values, whether we have power or don't have power. The study of Torah is always going to be the way to get there. And I think that Reform Judaism would say the same thing in many, many ways. Our difference will be on sort of letter of the law versus spirit of the law. It will be interpretive, and this should be one of those disagreements for the sake of God, right? What does the Torah mean when it says a particular mitzvah? Does it really mean that literally, or does it have some deeper meaning that we can interpret and understand in it? And but Reform Judaism doesn't reject Torah in that sense. It just requires a different kind of interpretation sometimes. So he says on page 165, so long as it keeps studying, the Jewish people cannot die, right? And I think that's puts it in a nutshell, right? He talks about how our daily acts and our daily interactions have the ability to be a sanctification of God, of bringing God into the world. Now, creating Jewish literacy, and he speaks about how Judaism achieves literacy among its population a long time ago, and that's really extraordinary. And it's one of the things that has certainly helped preserve the Jewish people over time is the literacy rate among our people, which translates now into this commitment to education that we pride ourselves on. Now education doesn't necessarily lead to perfection. It doesn't mean that we're not still susceptible to manipulation in one way or another. As one of my professors used to say, one of the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, Heidegger, was a Nazi, right? So knowledge all by itself won't be enough, but the constant reflection on what we learn, the questioning of what we learn, questioning authority, arguing and debate, making that argument into holiness as it does in the Talmud, as Rabbi Evan mentioned a few minutes ago. That's how we create a covenantal society. And on page 175, Rabbi Sachs puts it this way: creating a covenantal society in our own land and a genuine dialogue with humanity elsewhere, right? So this is the goal, something that's much more difficult, said in the late 20th and into the 21st century than it was even 100 years ago. Right? So I think we're coming close to the end here. So just final thoughts from folks. And I see Andy waving.
Well, it just stuck out to me, the power and responsibility, and where I certainly think that we should have separation of church and state, and I do not think that we should be opposing this. It wouldn't that be something if those in power took that seriously? I mean, how often do the ones with the most power get the biggest breaks and
Mhm.
have no responsibility? So
Right.
maybe they should just read the Torah. This is what I love about
Spider-Man,
Judaism.
as I said, right? We should not discount the fact that Spider-Man, that line, with great power comes great responsibility, was written by a Jewish guy, Stan Lee, who was actually Lieber, but, he learned it somewhere.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really, it would be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what years ago. I mean, you may remember this story. There was a guy named Ivan Boesky, who was convicted of insider trading right about the same time that he made a big contribution to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York to build the Boesky Library at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And after a lot of angst, the Jewish Theological Center invited Boesky to come in and learn, right? To study with them, to essentially to atone, and worked with him on that process of understanding that he had responsibility. It was a life-changing event for a lot of people, I think, actually. Other thoughts? Yeah, Merle? You're on mute, Merle. Can you unmute?
There was a question on Jeopardy last week about what was the oldest Jewish community in the Caribbean. And the answer was in Curacao. And that the first Jews arrived there in 1634, and they built a wonderful synagogue, and it's the most ancient synagogue in all the Americas. But no one knew the answer. I don't think they had any Jews on that day. But I thought that was fascinating, that you wouldn't think that the oldest synagogue in the Americas is in Curacao.
Yeah. Yeah, the oldest is in Curacao, and I think the second oldest is St. Thomas, actually. And then you get to the ones on the mainland. After that, I think it's the Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island after that. So, but that's true. And that those were Jews from Portugal, right? They were Sephardic Jews, actually, who started that sanctuary, started that synagogue. And of course, it's still there. If you go to Curacao, if you go to St. Thomas, you can visit those synagogues. So.
It is still there, and it has a sand floor,
right.
So the sound, it wouldn't tell the presence of other people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was told. I don't know if it's true or not.
I think there's a few things there. I mean, I've heard also that it's the reminder of the 40 years in the wilderness, right?
We
that
were
they
there.
deliberately put the sand there to remind themselves of the wandering in the desert.
Possible, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we were there.
Yeah. So I've been to the one at St. Thomas, where a friend of mine is actually the rabbi, but I haven't been to the one in Curacao.
We got there too late on a Friday. They were closed.
Yeah. So when this is over, if anyone's going to St. Thomas, you can say hello to my friend Michael Feshbach. I'll make sure he's there to greet you.
Okay.
St. Thomas, I've never been there.
Yeah.
We tried to get there and we couldn't. We ate lunch first.
Is it a large enough?
Okay. Last comment. I think Sarah was waving.
Yes. Well, there were Jews in the Caribbean very early, even on ships that left Spain during the expulsion of the Jews in Portugal. And there were Jews on those islands that came by boat, even, in the 15th century. So
right.
They may not have built synagogues, but they were there very early.
Right. Well, this is an interesting thing, even going back as far as Columbus's original voyage. I mean, that 1492 is an important year in Jewish history, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And interestingly, on Columbus's voyages, unlike all the other voyages from that time and place, there were no priests on board Columbus's ship, and nobody really knows why. But one theory is that there were enough hidden Jews on board that they were not interested in having the priest with them. I don't know. I mean, a lot of that is conjecture. I don't think there's historical proof of that.
But the second part of my comment was just now that we have the Biden administration, there's many Jews that are very visible in the administration. See the COVID briefings. 2 out of the 3 people at the COVID briefings are Jewish people. And even though we don't have a Jewish president or vice president, we have many Jewish people in influential jobs in that administration. Janet Yellen and the chief of staff, I believe, is Jewish.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, yes.
I think there's a minion actually. You know, so
Also, one of the 2 lawyers that are going to be defending Trump is a very Orthodox Jew who wants them to stall on Shabbat so that he can observe Shabbat.
yeah.
So we got Jews on both sides of the political spectrum.
Well, we always have, and there were certainly Jews in the last administration as well. And you know, and actually, I think one thing the last president and this president have in common are Jewish grandchildren. So, which is kind of an amazing thing. And so all of this leads us back to that same thing, that how difficult it is to you know, and this is the pressure we have to keep on this administration as much as we did on the last one, about being responsible and covenantal in our relationships with others, right? So, all right, thanks everybody. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both, rabbis.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody have a great day.
You too, Ash.
Thank you, Holly.
Holly, thank you.